Chapter 35 is looking at America's involvement in World War II from 1941 to 1945. Now, to begin with, remember the whole reason why the United States went to war in World War II was because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And with Pearl Harbor, that discussion about whether or not we should be involved or not involved, all of that went away. With this attack, it is 100% unity behind the United States' involvements. There's not really a lot of worries about immigrants' loyalties, aka the Germans and the Italians, a little bit, but not to the same extent that we saw in World War I. All of that's true except for the Japanese. So this instant unity and the fact that we have a real enemy who has attacked us, and also add into the fact the racism that was going on during the day against the Japanese on the West Coast, all coalesces against let's get the Japanese out of here. Especially aimed at both the Issei and the Nisei. The Issei are Japanese-born immigrants, and the Nisei are their American-born children. So these are people who are American-born who have ancestors who have obviously come from Japan, but yet the racism and the fear for their loyalty supersedes whether or not they have rights as American citizens. So, in 1941, the President issues Executive Order 9006 to remove all people of interest, basically, from the West Coast. They called this an evacuation. But the reality is that these people were being held against their will in internment camps. They said that this was a military necessity, and because it was a time of peril, they had to evacuate the West Coast. Now, the reality is there's also a lot of greed involved in this as well, because once the Issei and the Nisei are removed, all of their businesses, their homes, everything else is foreclosed upon and can be bought up for a very cheap price by the white citizens who are left behind. So 110,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were removed from the West Coast and sent to these internment camps. 2/3 of them were actually American-born. And in 1944, the Supreme Court ruled in Korematsu versus the United States that this executive order was okay, that because it's a time of war, it's a necessity for military reasons, it was okay to intern or hold against the will these American people. But in 1988, though, the U.S. government did finally issue an official apology for the internment of these Japanese and gave whoever was left $20,000 in reparations for the damages that they faced. Here you see this is in 1923, so long before the internment occurred, you can already see the racism aimed at the Japanese. Also keep in mind, this did not happen in Hawaii, where there was a much larger Japanese population, just on the west coast of the United States, because there's just enough of them to make the white people there kind of scared. Here you see obviously a very racist propaganda poster aimed at the Japanese. And these are the Issei and Nisei being evacuated, quote unquote, to the relocation centers. And here are some boys at one of the more famous of the camps at Manzanar internment camp. Now, to begin with, obviously we know FDR had been itching to get into this war from a long time ago, and in fact we'd already been preparing for this war. He'd already been meeting with Churchill prior to this at the Atlantic Charter Conference. We'd already been giving supplies and selling supplies to the Allies. But now that the U.S. is officially in this war, the United States, along with the other Allies, decide that to follow a Europe First strategy, which basically means the United States is going to be fighting a two-front war. We're obviously going to be focusing our attention on the Pacific in Japan, but not a whole lot of other countries are going to be helping us there until Hitler is knocked out of this war. He was deemed to be a bigger threat. This is called a Europe First strategy. And once Hitler was knocked out of the war, then the other allies would come and assist us. We did have Australia in the Pacific, obviously. But other than that, it's time to get ready for war. We are lucky in the sense that we were already mobilizing for war because of that Lend-Lease Act that had already been passed. But still, we don't have time to wait around for all of the new stuff to get up and running. We need to get this stuff overseas right now, and it's going to cost a lot of money. Like I said before, this is the official end to the Great Depression because of the massive military spending that is going on. Got people back to work. But we also need the government to regulate that industry. So the War Productions Board was created to give government contracts to businesses who converted from a peacetime production to a wartime production. So we stopped building cars, we started building tanks. We stopped building vacuum cleaners, we started building guns. Most peacetime factories were converted into a wartime focus because everything is focusing on the war effort. And in 1942 alone, we spent $100 billion on the war costs. That's a whole lot of money. Other than the other stuff that we need to build, we need to rebuild up our fleet, especially in the Pacific. Lucky for the United States, Henry J. Kaiser, an American industrialist, found a way to build these ships very, very quickly. These are known as Liberty ships. This is basically using that assembly line tactic to build warships. He was able to use prefabricated parts and build ships in 14 days that had once taken months to do. And quickly we were able to rebuild our fleet after Pearl Harbor, and that's very important, obviously. Other than just war material, we also need farm products as well in order to feed our soldiers. So everything is now focusing on the war effort. We begin a rationing campaign that every month citizens would get ration cards. You could only use so many ration stamps because the rest of the food had to go to the men overseas. Also, in order to control the economy, ensure that our focus is completely on this war effort, the government created the Office of Price Administration, or the OPA, to stabilize prices, to stabilize rents. They basically froze prices so that nobody was profiteering off of the war effort. And then last but not least, the government also created the War Labor Board. This is all very similar to what we saw happen during World War I. Once again, this organization establishes wage controls in national industries. It also serves as the go-between between labor and industry. The goal here is not to have a strike. We can't afford for major labor unions to go on strike during the war because everyone needs to be behind the war effort. We are going to overwhelm them with our industrialization. This is what wins us the war, is our ability to mobilize quickly and overwhelm them with war material. Oh, and I'm sorry. And in June of 43, Congress also passed the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act, giving the government the authority to seize and operate any industries that were considered necessary for the war effort if a threat of a strike was imminent. Here you see, this is also a propaganda poster here on the left depicting the role women would play in World War II. She is known as Rosie the Riveter. She is the every woman willing to go to work because the men are off fighting in the war overseas. Here are some real life, quote-unquote, Rosie the Riveters working in factories across the United States. But there are still some issues to be dealt with, as massive amounts of people still coming out of the South come to the North looking for jobs, and as millions of men go overseas to fight in Europe and in the Pacific, we need people to work on the farms in order to harvest all of these agricultural products in order to feed our troops. So in 1942, in a deal with the Mexican government, the U.S. established the Bracero program to bring in unskilled Mexican laborers in order to work on our farms so that we would have these agricultural products. Also, another major change that we see in our society at this time is the expansion of the Sun Belt. This is going to continue on even after World War II is over. A massive population explosion in the southern states and the southwestern states as well, starting because Congress gave about $6 million in new contracts to build military factories in what is known as the Sun Belt. This is going to increase their economic development, and that's going to continue on, like I said, even after World War II. But there are still some racial issues to be dealt with. Remember, by World War II, there is still a segregated military. There are still racial issues back at home, especially as it pertains to labor. So one such labor union leader, an African American by the name of A. Philip Randolph. He was a union leader for the sleeping car porters, which was a traditional African American organization, called for a march on Washington in 1941. He felt that blacks were facing discrimination both in the military and also in job opportunities. He called for a, quote, double V, a victory over discrimination and a victory over Hitler, or a victory over fascism. This is really the start of the modern civil rights movement, which we'll talk about later on as well. In response, FDR made a deal to create the Fair Employment Practices Commission that at least in war industries, they would not be allowed to discriminate on the basis of race. That is not the same as for in the military. The military remained segregated until 1948. But at least it's a start in the right direction to ending discrimination. FDR couldn't deal with any sort of labor union strikes or any sort of problems like that. He had to focus all of his attention on this war effort. Also, another major change in American society is the migration of Native Americans during the war to the cities, moving outside of the reservation, going to look for jobs in the major cities of the United States. This is a drastic change from past generations. In 1940, just to give you an example, 90% of the tribe lived on the reservation. By 2000, about half of all Native American tribes actually lived in the cities. But other than that, Native Americans played a role in the war effort as well. Specifically, the Navajo and Comanche code talkers in the Pacific, using the Navajo language to establish a code that was actually never broken by the Japanese. And last but not least, another racial issue that occurred in 1943 Los Angeles, known as the Zoot Suit Riot. The Zoot Suit was a popular style of suit that was very popular, like I said, among Mexicans at this time. It's that, if you think of a Halloween costume like a gangster, that's what a Zoot Suit looks like. Because there were so many Mexicans coming up from Mexico for the Bracero program and looking for jobs in just anyway, this is going to create a lot of racial tension. In 1943, sailors who were on leave in Los Angeles saw a bunch of Mexicans, obviously wearing Zoot Suits in Los Angeles, angry over their taking over, quote-unquote, in Los Angeles. They started beating them up. This led to a major riot, and in the end, the Mexicans were the ones actually blamed for this riot. And last but not least, in Detroit of 1943, a race riot erupted between whites and blacks in the city. Once again, there's competition for jobs, and also more and more blacks are moving to the northern cities. In the end, 25 blacks were dead and 9 whites were dead in the Detroit race riot of 43. Here you see massive migrations of the population all over the country. Here are some of those Navajo code talkers, like I said, in 1943. Now, changes in the economy. By the end of the war, the GNP, our gross national product, actually doubled. All of this is part because of consumer spending. The gross national product, this is how much stuff we produce. So this is going to reinvigorate our economy at this time. People are saving money because during the war there's not a lot of consumer products to buy, but people are making money working in the factories, working as soldiers overseas. So when World War II was actually over, there was a real fear that we were going to go back into a depression. That's not going to happen because people now have money in their pockets to spend. And we'll talk about that when we get to the late 40s, early 50s. Another major effect of World War II is the creation of a welfare state. And that by and large, the government, more so than ever before in history, affects our daily lives, that it has its fingers in all of our lives. You know, prior to this time and prior to the New Deal, most people only dealt with their local and state governments, that the federal government did not have this much of a role in our lives. From rationing to employment to housing projects, daycare, healthcare, all of this stuff is now happening after the New Deal and now World War II. But because of the war, we see the creation of a massive national debt. In fact, World War II alone cost us 2 times all of the spending that we had done since 1776. But it was necessary, using that Keynesian economics that we've talked about, in order to jumpstart this war, to overwhelm the Axis powers with our military prowess.